Moving to Israel? Awesome. Acclimated to life here? Not as awesome. Welcome to Oleh Chadash Toolbox Talks, where co-hosts Ofer Nachshon, CEO of Aliyah Pavlay, and Sid Slivko meet twice a month to discuss with different service providers around the country tips and tricks to help you acclimate to your life here in Israel.
Thank you all very much for joining me tonight for our second in a series of panel discussions on Israel and the diaspora, sponsored by Aliyah Pavlay. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Rabbi Sid Slivko. I'm here with my colleague Avital Stahl, who in my array is on the top row. And the two of us will be interviewing this distinguished panel of guests on behalf of Aliyah Pavlay. In addition to Avital, we also have Ofer Nachshon, who's the CEO of Aliyah Pavlay. Today, we're going to respond to the question, is the Israel-diaspora relationship sustainable? And Avital and I, as I said, will be asking our own questions, and I invite you to post your questions as well in the chat room on Zoom. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible in the time that's allotted. I can't promise, but they will be recorded in our chat room, and hopefully we'll be able to return to them after the meeting. So with that, let me begin by introducing the panelists. I will do this in alphabetical order. Liat Collins, British-born, is an award-winning journalist who's been a reporter, columnist, and editor at the Jerusalem Post since 1988, after she received her BA and master's degree, cum laude, from Hebrew U. We also have Professor Jonathan Sarna, who's professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University and chief historian of the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. And if you ever visit Philadelphia, I highly recommend to go see it. He's also the past president of the Association for Jewish Studies and chair of the Academic Advisory and Editorial Board of the American Jewish Archives. And Acharon Chaviv, Professor Gil Troy, is an award-winning author and lecturer, distinguished scholar of North American history at McGill University. And he's also a senior fellow at of Zionist thought at the Jewish People Policy Institute, which is the global think tank of the Jewish people. He also has a regular column in the Jerusalem Post and has appeared in the New York Times and the New Republic and many other major media outlets. So to our panelists, good evening, and thank you very much for agreeing to participate in this panel tonight. We welcome you.
Thanks for having us.
I'm going to start by asking the first question, and this is open to everybody. So please feel free to answer in any order you like. We talk about the Israel diaspora Jewish communities. What is the responsibility that the Israel community has towards the diaspora? And what is the responsibility that the diaspora community has towards Israel?
Well, if nobody mind, first of all, good evening, and thanks for inviting me and such a distinguished co-panelists. I actually kind of rephrased the question in the title of the seminar to, is it sustainable, to how can we make it sustainable? Because I think that's the more important point. Something else I think is very important is, although we're all speaking in English, and obviously this focus is on North America, we need to remember that there's more to the diaspora than just North America, and more to the North America than just the tri-state area and California, for example, the range in between. Having said that, I think everyone probably knows the phrase "Kol Yisrael Arovim Ze Leze," all Israel is responsible one for the other. It's a bit of a cliche, but I think in this point, it's just absolutely spot on. We are intertwined. We are one family. We're one nation. We're one people. And from that stems our mutual responsibility, one for the other. We can't get away from it. It's family.
And I absolutely agree with the last part of what Liat said, that and I think the events of October 7th, if when Israel is under attack, you feel the pain, you're part of one Jewish people. But I do want to suggest that the time has come to appreciate, especially in Israel, that the diaspora is an entirely different place than it was in 1948. For a long time in Israel, it was taught there are many different countries, and the Machon Liyadut Zmanenu, the Institute for Contemporary Jewry, had an expert here and an expert there, and the high school textbooks talk about Argentina and Morocco and the like. No, 90% of world Jewry today lives in North America and Israel. 90%. And indeed, Jews who used to live all over the world for all sorts of reasons don't. We are fast becoming a first world people with vast implications in Jewish life. And the smaller communities, I agree with Liat, they exist. I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about South Africa, but South Africa has half as many Jews as it used to have. Argentina, half as many, and it's the young people who have left. Venezuela has no Jews, and Russia practically finished. So that's a new world, and we need to come to terms with it. And I want to add and say, I think with great respect and nothing to do with the people on this call, Israelis are ill-prepared to understand the 45% of world Jewry that now lives in North America. There's exactly one program dealing with American Jewry. It's at Haifa University. The Hebrew University has nobody. Tel Aviv University has nobody. The fact that there are not people who understand North American Jewry when it is growing in significance is a terrible scandal. And we're paying a terrible price for the fact that everybody thinks they know North American Jewry, but they really don't, and it's not systematically studied. And I would be surprised if you would find many Israelis who realize that today there are two Jewish centers, like Bavel Yerushalayim, North America and Israel. And we have to think about the Jewish world in a new way. And I think we need to recreate our institutions to think in that way as well.
Thank you.
Jonathan, there's a price to being wise. And when you make intelligent comments, what happens is somebody recruits you and gives you yet more things to do on your very, very busy to-do list. And I just joined the JPPI, the Jewish People's Policy Institute. And my job, my first mission is to launch a Peoplehood course in Hebrew and in Israeli, and to really try to figure out a course that would work throughout the universities on how to teach Peoplehood. And one of the things I'm very sensitive to, and I think part of the reason why they turn to me, is they want to make sure that it's someone who also speaks not only Israeli, but also American. And so I want to invite you to join me in a consultative basis. And I hope you don't regret that I've ambushed you in public. And but I will text you on the side that if you want to skip that, you can. But I completely agree with you.
Nothing more important than
Right.
what
I completely agree with you that we need to acknowledge that things are changing, and we as historians are going to sin tonight, because we're going to try to understand the historic significance of October 7th and the aftermath when we're still in it. But I completely agree with you that indeed on October 7th, every single Jew all over the world who woke up and said, oh my goodness, what is happening, had what I call a peoplehood moment. And that second moment, that second initiative, which was, what are we going to do about it? is what I call a Zionist movement. And we have to understand that peoplehood is that feeling of belonging, of shayachut, of feeling connected, of knowing that you're part of something bigger. And Zionism takes those feelings and tries to turn it into some kind of constructive response. So that there are people who are trying to say, oh, Zionism failed on October 7th. No, the Israeli government certainly failed. The IDF had a moment of great failure. But first of all, Israelis saved Israel on October 7th. And one of the reasons why is because of Zionism. And Zionism has always, as I argued last week in my column, has always struggled with the tragedy of Jewish history. But we don't get stuck in the tragedy. We figure out how to make new pathways and make new history. And I think that's happening right now. And so I think this conversation, especially with such distinguished colleagues who I've learned so much from you, Liat, over the years, I've learned so much from you, Jonathan, over the years, is really important for us to be thinking about how do we create that new conversation. And one of the things I want to put on the table is I think it's time for us to stop being afraid of our youth and stop defining the American Jewish community by Peter Beinart and the small number of, if not now, Jewish Voice for Peace, what I call un-Jews. Look what happened in Washington in mid-November. 290,000 Jews marched in Washington. And by the way, one of my students sent me an email saying, I never felt so lonely, where are the non-Jews? But that's for another conversation. But that night, 150, mostly Jews, but also non-Jews, protested at the Democratic National Committee. And if you watch the Washington Post, the New York Times coverage, you'd think the two events were equal. But it's not only the Washington Post and the New York Times. I know we love to bash them. In our own Jewish community, we give far too much oxygen to the extremists. And for years, I've been arguing, look at the Pew studies that show 83% of American Jews, which includes young people, feel connected to Israel. And we see that in Birthright. And so we have to figure out, of course, I have no problem calling out the extremists, but I don't want them to run the agenda. I think we have to think about how we restructure the agenda so that we speak really to what I call the silenced majority and hear their voice and also give them the tools so they can have that peoplehood moment and that Zionist moment, not just when we're attacked, but when also we're trying to live and create a meaningful life.
I think that it really comes down to a matter of fostering that Jewish pride that's obviously there, that Jewish identity that's there, and the Jewish pride that's there, and to not be the victim. I think that's probably the most important thing, that we're with the majority is silenced because it's scared. And that coming together, that was an incredibly powerful moment, the Washington March, because people came together and they had that safety in numbers, and they said, and they were willing to say, yes, we're here, we're going to be counted, and we have that Jewish pride. And I think that's really what we need to foster, that not only that they have a pride, but they have what to be proud about, to give them the tools to say that this is, and we have an incredible history. I mean, we unparalleled. It's a miracle. Israel is a miracle. Its existence is a miracle. Hebrew language is a miracle. And we need to be able to say that, and that just the same as any other diaspora community can feel pride and not feel assaulted for it. There's no reason why you can't be a proud Irish American and proud Greek American, Italian American, and so on. And we must be able to have that, and without the specter of dual loyalty, which maybe hangs over also.
Yeah, well, I want. Did you want? Okay.
No, go ahead.
I was going to make 2 points. One, I want to strengthen what Gil said, in which I fully agree. And I happen to have been the professor who was invited to the Senate. The House hearings got all of the attention because of Congresswoman Stefanik, but I actually learned very interesting things being at the Senate hearing of the HELP, it stands for Housing, Education, Labor, Pensions Committee. And one of the things I learned was that many of the Congress people had been told by the chair of the HELP committee, Bernie Sanders, American Jews no longer support Israel in the same way. It's a new day. You shouldn't go after these issues. And he actually refused to appear when we were there. But they saw 300,000 people That's more than came out for Martin Luther King's famous march on Washington. And that had an enormous impact and suggested to people, hey, there are a lot of Jews who still care about Israel. And you could really begin to see that change. There are other things we can talk about later about what's changed in America since Congress began looking at anti-Semitism on college campuses, because a lot of it is not really being well publicized. But I do want to make that point. The second point, though, I want to make is much more pessimistic. The other thing we haven't come to terms with, because there's no equivalent in Jewish history, is, according to Pew, 70% of non-Orthodox Jews who have married since the year 2000 married spouses who do not identify as Jews, meaning this is not an issue of did they convert or reform or non-reform. They asked Pew, what's your religion? What's your spouse's religion? That's an enormous number, 70%. And we are also now seeing a significant number of children of intermarrieds at any university, including my own. And one has to say that they have been brought up by one parent who doesn't quite get this Israel connection. They don't feel it in the same way. We need to be aware that this 70% of non-Orthodox Jews, that's going to be a more and more important factor. And we don't have enormous experience, and there is, of course, a significant debate over how to deal with it. Many of those folks know they wouldn't be accepted in Israel, but, you know, some don't care about that. So we haven't, because there's nobody who really focuses on what's important, I don't think we have come to terms with that, or even asked the question, how many of the folks, some of them I know personally, but how many of the folks who are leading the so-called progressive charge, meaning backing away from Israel, anti-Israel, how many of them have non-Jewish spouses or one non-Jewish parent? I suspect the answer is a great many. And I did a small study based on the Pew. It's not my field, but I felt it was ignored. And if you remember, the Pew asked about how you feel about Israel, and how do you feel about are all Jews your relatives? Basic Jewish values. And it's easy to see that there is a wide chasm between those who have two Jewish parents and those who have one. And
Dr. Starna, I have an additional question for you, moving on to the topic of Aliyah a little bit.
Great.
Israel is very interested in getting quality people, so educated people, productive people, to move to Israel. And I want to talk a little bit about what that's going to do to the diaspora in the long terms, in terms of a social, political, economical change.
It's a wonderful question. Let me start by saying there are moments like this where Israelis sometimes exaggerate what's happening. The Jerusalem Post published a poll last week suggesting 35% of Orthodox Jews are contemplating Aliyah. Since I was speaking at an Orthodox congregation, I asked them, how many of you are contemplating Aliyah? No, it wasn't 1 in 3, or anything like that. it doesn't, many of those people have been to Israel. Some of them went as soon as the war allowed them to go. We want to be with their people. I think something new is happening, and that is a whole group of Jews who are comfortable in both countries. They're comfortable, as Gil Troy is comfortable in both settings. And I like to think, even though I live on the other side, I've spent 5.5 years living in Israel in different sabbaticals and times in yeshivas. We're comfortable in both places. And that is a more realistic goal in many ways. I do think there will be Aliyah among young traditional Jews, largely because what's really going on, we hear a lot about anti-Semitism in terms of harassment or attacks on Jews, but much more serious is the growing evidence of discrimination on the part of job appointers, people who are hiring managers. Somebody recently published, I think, a study where 25% of hiring managers said that they would be reluctant to hire Jews, either because they were white or because they were Jews or because they supported Israel. That's a big number. And far fewer Jews are in the academy. I hope I'm not, I hope Gil won't be angry at me when I reveal that when Gil and I entered the academy at about the same time, the Jewish, I have the number here, about 1/5 of elite American academics were Jewish, 1 in 5. When somebody recently looked at American universities, top ones, same ones, 4% of the academics, less than 30, are Jews. So we've gone from a time when people like Gil and I said, oh, we can be accepted at the university. Indeed, the university was excited. I'm the first person ever to do a PhD in American Jewish history at Yale, and the first American Jewish historian in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Not because I'm so great, but it was recognition of Jews and Judaism. But now,
I'm gonna piggyback exactly off of this point and ask Gil and Liat the following question, which is exactly about what you're talking about. And how do we think that mass Aliyah, particularly of educated individuals, is going to affect support for Israel in the diaspora, and how important do we think it is to keep pro-Israel influencers in the diaspora?
If I can answer first there, Gil.
Yes, please.
The question about the influencers, I think is in this modern world, with this hybrid world with social media, I don't think it matters where they are, if they're here or if they're there. And I think it would actually give out a stronger message if they were to come and say, yeah, we're all in on this. I worry about, I remember a few years ago when Jeremy Corbyn looked like he would be heading Labour into a government in England, and there was panic among the British jury, right? I would say panic, and justified. And people talked then about the Venezuelan effect, which would, when the strongest part of the community leaves, so although you have a very large number of people left behind, they're not necessarily the ones who are financing the charities and supporting charities and institutions, the Jewish institutions and so on. If the leaders of the Jewish community lead, they were more likely to take the money with them and finance something in Israel than carry on. We've already seen money being pulled out of Harvard, for example. And I think that that's something that really needs to be taken into account, like what will happen from that point of view, not just the numbers that leave, but who it is who are leaving. And also if it's the young and Orthodox who are leaving, then what's that going to mean for the assimilation and the intermarriage rate?
Gil, can I turn the question to you?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer it personally as someone who came here 17 years ago with my wife and 4 kids on sabbatical from McGill University, and from 2000 to 2007 had been very, very involved in trying to articulate what I call identity Zionism and defending Israel at the McGill campus and all over North America. And then it's turned into the world's longest sabbatical, and we've made Aliyah, and we're now living here. I definitely relearned what I learned growing up when they talked about real estate, location, location, location. It does matter. And even though we do live in a global world, and even though I can write articles that are accepted in mainstream American newspapers, partially your perspective changes, right? You start thinking differently. And I do actually feel some guilt, much as I'm so satisfied with our life here and so proud of my kids who are actually doing what's most important in Jewish history right now, which is defending the state in 3 different places at this point. But I do feel a little residual guilt that I was part of a community in Montreal, and I let it go. I left it behind. And to the extent that I still have ties there, I'm not as involved, and I haven't had the same kind of impact I had from 2000 to 2007 subsequently. So location does matter. And I did notice it was interesting during the highly polarized Trump years, when I wrote, as an American historian sometimes, about what was going on, and some of my Jewish colleagues didn't like what they read, would say, "Oh, you don't get it because you're living in Israel." Now, I was writing in that mode as an American historian, so people sort of used my location against me at that moment. Having said that, it's very important that each one of us be on our own journey. And as someone who spent half my life, more than half my life in the United States of America, I never judge. I know that Aliyah is the hardest thing we ever did. It ended up being the best thing I ever did, but it was the hardest thing we ever did as a family. And I would never sit and tell anyone, do it, don't do it. I would definitely give advice about how to do it better, how to do it worse. That's a different kind of conversation.
And Hebrew.
Yeah. But I think what we do need to think about, and I like the way Jonathan was framing it, which is that this all or nothing approach and this judgmentalness of who's good and who's bad just is not helpful to us. We see how embattled we are, and I hate that word, but we are embattled in many ways. We see how small a minority we are, and we're so good at passing judgment on one another. We're so good at creating levels of clubs that you're not part of, or you're not part of. I'm hoping, I'm not predicting, I'm hoping that this peoplehood moment, the Zionist moment, was also going to be a 67 moment. And in 1967, everything changed. Right. Things got scrambled in a dramatic way. Yes, there was an Aliyah, but not a mass Aliyah, because American Jewry and mass Aliyah are never going to quite go together. Americans, especially now 4th generation Americans, especially the ones who are intermarried, are so deeply rooted in their American identity, in their American story. But to the extent that we open up more opportunities for American Jews to really, really, really feel home here for a month, for 3 months, for 6 months, as you've done so beautifully, Jonathan, to the extent that we create a forum in the Knesset, as Natan Sharansky and I have called for, where we have some kind of global parliament of the Jewish people, where American Jews, especially, but British Jews and Australian Jews, feel like they have some kind of voice, even if it's not determinative, but at least it's consultative. To the extent that we think about a day after, and I have to say one of the things that's helpful about this conversation is that we're so obsessed in Israel with the day after. What's going to happen with Bibi? What's going to happen with the war? We haven't really thought about what does the day after look like in terms of diaspora Jewry and Israel? What does the day after look like when many of us and many of our brothers and sisters in the diaspora have had a profound experience, have had a profoundly upsetting experience at Harvard, at Yale, at Brandeis, at Rutgers, in high school, in elementary schools, I'm reading, on the streets. And what can we do to restructure the conversation, to reframe the conversation, so that it's less about who's living where, but more about how do we help one another wherever we're living. And I've always believed that the most effective Aliyah strategy is an identity Zionist strategy. If you become part of the Jewish people and feel a part of the Jewish people, if you become part of the Zionist conversation, if you're on what my mentor Mel Riesfeld called the ladder of Zionist achievement, and you first start by understanding that we're a people, not just a religion, that we have a sense of mutual responsibility, as you said, Leah, that at the end of the day, you will make Aliyah not because you've been guilted into it, but because for a certain percentage, it'll be a natural expression of that identity journey. And so I'm much more interested in building an identity journey that has Israel at the center, because I still don't see a more effective tool, especially for the non-religious community, than Israel, that's more inspiring, that's more representative of so many different vast dimensions of the Jewish experience, and that can also bring more people in, and especially now, with the South still burning.
I think also that would also help.
The South, as in the same way that the settlers in 1967, and you can love them or hate them, but learn from them. The settlers in 1967, the religious Zionist community said, hey, wait a minute, we're going to use the settlements as an opportunity to rebuild a vision of who we are and who we want our community to be. And the religious Zionist community changed profoundly starting in 1967 or the early 70s. I think we throughout the Zionist world should use the South as our platform, both in Israel and throughout the diaspora, to create new communities, to create new visions, to create new excitement. It's empty in some parts there, and it's hurting in some parts there. And of course, working with the current inhabitants, I think we can do amazing things there as an amazing Jewish community.
I think that would also answer part of the question about the intermarriage and the problems of assimilation within the North American community. Because if you're focusing, as you say, on the having this common identity and what we have in common, it gives you that sense of pride, and that will bring people together. You're going to be looking for somebody with similar values and similar interests. If you're fostering that, I think that will help a lot with the assimilation and intermarriage as a byproduct, which is an added benefit.
I wanted to change the order of our questions a little bit, just because Sid, I know this is not the next question, but this is exactly what you guys are talking about. The general notion is that Israel is building things in Israel, and the diaspora kind of pays for it or fits the bill. What do we think the responsibility is of Israelis, Israeli youth, towards the diaspora and diaspora institutions?
Can I please play off of what you asked as well, because we've been discussing the idea of the new conversation, and a conversation generally needs to work in two directions, otherwise it's a monologue. So if we're only focusing on the development of Israel, what about the Israeli end of the conversation towards the American community? Are we only talking about geocentric Jewish peoplehood? Or are we talking about global Jewish peoplehood? Let's remember the Talmud that we study around the world is the Talmud that was written in Bavel, not the Talmud that was written in Israel. So to pick up on what Avital was saying, what is Israel going to contribute to the building up of the American Jewish community, the British Jewish community, the Canadian Jewish community, to strengthen them so that there can be an equal conversation rather than a dependency on one to survive for the other?
So in the immediate wake of World War II, Shimon Rabinowitz argued that every Jewish community, wherever it is, big or small, needs to imagine that the whole fate of world Jewry rests on its shoulders. Later, Jewish historians will come along and realize that it's everybody together, but that it's important for every Jewish community to think of itself as having that responsibility. I think that was very wise and important in our day. I think the American Jewish community since October 7th is undergoing profound changes. I want to absolutely second what Gil said, that this trauma will have big impacts. Roughly 3/4 of all American Jewish college students say they've either personally experienced or have witnessed anti-Semitism in the last month since October 7th. I wanted to see if that's right. I spoke to a group of high school students gathered in Boston right after Christmas, and I asked them exactly that question. And about 3/4 of them said yes. A few years ago? No way. A few years ago, anti-Semitism was something our grandparents experienced. There's a book, The Death of American Anti-Semitism, it's called. And it called for published in 2000, I think, called for the dismantling of the fight against anti-Semitism and putting all of the money to better use. So we've had a very profound change. Now, I don't want to miss the very important question. I think, first of all, Israelis should know much more about American Jewry. Every American Jewish university, for better or worse, has someone who teaches about Israel. That you don't even have anybody who teaches about North America is a disaster. But beyond that, what we have not figured out is we have a new tool to promote ties at a young age that would benefit both. My dream is every American child Zooms once a week with an Israeli partner. It would be free. Do it on Sunday when the American is home and the Israeli, so you don't have the time problem. And that would have vast benefits, not only linguistically, but people would say, if I want to know about Israel, I'll ask my friend Chaim in Haifa. I don't have to rely on CNN. He'll tell me. And indeed, at some level, those of us who had friends in Israel follow Israel news in a very different way than those who get everything they know from CNN. And I would love to see those one-to-one ties, much easier than the old pen pals because it's on Zoom, and it would have a major impact over time and cost next to nothing.
Jonathan, let me just interrupt. There was the Jewish Agency, approximately 20 some odd years ago, actually had a program that was functioning in that same vein, where they had a platform where students from diaspora communities and students from Israeli schools would be communicating with each other, working on programs, working on joint projects, and it was very successful for a small period of time. What happened to it? What usually happens to programs like this? Budget.
Right. Well, that's why I said this is free. And look, I think just as civil society has taken on in Israel such a vast role, maybe they should take it upon themselves, led by people who are familiar with North America, to create those links. The whole field of teaching Israel in the diaspora is right in the process of being revolutionized. The old textbooks are clearly not going to work. There's a lot of concern, and of course, as in so many things, there is a vast chasm between the Orthodox engaged community and the non-Orthodox, less engaged community of how that should be done. But let's focus, as Gil said, on these are our cousins. This is our family. That's kind of the alphabet of what we need to educate. But I don't think we should assume, as some in Israel have done, that that will be inherited genetically. I think it has to be taught and reinforced repeatedly. But that said, from what I can tell, the folks who really know Israel, they were in Israel for a few months. They went to yeshiva, or they served, in some year program. those folks get it. They feel it. They're in touch with their friends. It's really folks who don't know Israel, who are having, unfortunately, a great oversized impact on the discourse. And the lesson there is, the more who know it, the better it will be.
Okay. Yes, Liat, I see you're chomping at the bit here.
Well, Jonathan actually took my concluding comments. I was going to make a similar suggestion that there should be a Zoom relationship, not necessarily one-on-one, but between maybe in the Hebrew schools and Israeli schools, which do go study on Sundays. Unfortunately, we don't have Sundays off. So I thought that the idea of having those groups from a very young age also is a sort of ongoing thing. I think it happened in COVID a little bit, that during the lockdowns that people were more in touch, and I think that could be a definite direction to go. And there's also the shlichim, the emissaries from the various organizations who do work within youth movements and within the schools there. And I think I don't think you can overestimate the importance of knowing an Israeli, having met an Israeli as a person, so that then
Liat, this sounds like a great program for the Jerusalem Post to handle.
I'm gonna forward the next question to Gil. How would massive Aliyah, or like a big wave of Aliyah from North America following what happened on October 7th, impact assimilation, and what might be the biggest threat in terms of assimilation to diaspora Jews who are coming to Israel?
So I'll answer the question by dropping the word massive, because I just don't think it's happening. I mean, I know that, many people, every 5-10 years, there's another reason why we expect a massive American Aliyah, and for the various demographic reasons that Jonathan has mentioned, and also just for the ideological realities of American Jewry. I just don't think it's going to happen. But I will say this, that each Oleh and Oleh, and I do think we will see a jump. In other words, the numbers are so low that it's very easy to quintuple it, and it still won't make a difference in terms of the size, the sheer vast size of the American Jewish community. But every person who makes Aliyah doesn't just come with his or her family, and doesn't just come with his or her lift, but they come with that network of 20, 30, 50, 100 people who really care about you. And I think we've seen this, especially since October 7th. The number of emails I was getting and WhatsApp messages, in fact, the first couple of days was downright exhausting in the most beautiful ways, but also just like, it was just really, really tiring. So many people were so traumatized and so affected, and on two levels. One is they wanted to do something, they wanted to be a part of the story in the best sort of way. And secondly, they love me, they love my wife Linda, they love my kids, they know us. And there was a face to this trauma. They know that our kids are in the army. They know that my cousin was in Kibbutz Nirim and was in a safe house for 11 hours. And they cared. And so it's an interesting thing, because you're right, Jonathan, with each passing year, and look, one of the things we have to talk about is that American Jews are so much more successful than Irish Jews, or than Irish Americans or Italian Americans, not in terms of money, but in terms of keeping some sense of continuity. When I speak to Irish Catholic friends, Italian Catholic friends, they look, wow, you Jews have been able to keep it going to a certain extent in the 4th generation. So we have to, we're grading on a curve here. But that personal touch, that's, I know someone in Jerusalem, I know someone who goes to Yedidia, I know someone here, personalizes it in a very profound way. And one of the things we've done, I'm the voluntary education chair of Birthright. And the fact that from the start, Birthright always had the Mishlachat and always had 5 to 10 Israelis, many of them in the Israeli army, not because we're so militaristic, but because it's just easier to work with that extraordinary organization and pair up people of the same age. And we've seen this also in the last couple of weeks and months. I think I saw the list, there are 20 or 30 former Birthright members of Mishlachat who have fallen. And those Birthright kids know that. Yep. And those Birthright kids remember this one and that one from the bus. Right. And the personalization, it builds on the Zoom idea that you have, but it's a much more profound thing, because it's powerful, it's there. And I think one of the things we have to start saying to American Jews is that 2 DW equals 1 IL. 2 trips to Disney World equals 1 trip to Israel. So skip the Caribbean vacation next winter and have the grandparents take everybody to Israel. Come for the volunteer program, not to Africa or to Asia, but to your homeland.
And then make sure to do the follow-up.
But you need us, and we need one another. And we really need to start thinking about programs that build on this feeling that we've had, and let's start filling it with substance.
I would like to say, like, then do the follow-up. The Birthright trip is amazing, and it's such an immersion and it's such an exposure. But it's just those 10 days. I think you really need to make sure that those groups stay in touch wherever they are afterwards, and build new experiences together as well, not just sitting around and reminiscing about, do you remember what happened around that campfire, and do you remember that really good looking soldier, but dealing with the current issues that they have in common and keeping that contact going. I think that the follow-up is probably very important.
Right. I agree. By the way, one of the conversations we're starting to have, sorry to jump in, is with the 50,000 Israelis. How do we have a follow-up with them too? Because many of them come, they too have an immersive experience. They too have a mind-blowing experience. They too learn some of the things that, Jonathan, they weren't taught in high school or in college. They start with all these questions of peoplehood, right? And that's part of the reason that I'm hoping that this curriculum will help answer them. And we need to offer them also some kind of educational and ideological frameworks that help them.
Are you thinking about a reverse birthright?
I was just going to say that there is talk. I mean, the Ruderman people bring, and I probably meet with every group of Israelis that comes to Boston. The Ruderman people bring people. I'd love to see more of that. It used to be, oh, we can't bring them to America, they'll stay. But no serious person anymore believes that. And I think the more movement there is between Jewish communities, the more that Israelis appreciate their American cousins and vice versa, the more likely it is that folks will be there for one another in an hour of need. So I'm in favor, but it is worth knowing that the Birthright folks, Len Sachs has surveyed them, and they've, notwithstanding their young age, have been substantially pro-Israel. Not 100%, but it is a reminder that even 10 days has had, and with what we have heard here, has had a lasting impact. And it's really folks who don't know Israel, and who therefore didn't feel what we did. And we got to do something about it if we still can.
Maybe it's not just the personal touch, but also the fact that if you come to Israel for 10 days and you go completely from the far north to the deepest south and everywhere in between, and you realize how tiny this country is, and then you also understand what you're fighting for when you realize that it is just the size of New Jersey, and it, despite the vastness of the history and so on, you realize that when you're attacked, the country is really being attacked. That was an invasion on October 7th, and it affected the whole country.
Yeah, sure.
With that very important statement, I'm going to move on to the last question for our panel before we move on to maybe some questions from the audience. What is your vision for an effective or mutually beneficial Israel-diaspora relationship? Liat, we can start with you.
Well, as I said, and as Jonathan Sana said before me, Professor Sana, that I really think that to have these meetings in some form, to have the links that cross over between the continents, I think that's very important to foster that. The existence of Birthright obviously is hugely important, and for larger different groups, not maybe just only for the university stage, maybe also later on for other groups. I see that is happening. So I think that's one thing. I think the importance of Hebrew is I think that it's I mean, I joked before, but it is important that I think to some extent, North American Jewry half suspects that we speak Yiddish here and not that we speak Hebrew, and yet 50% of the population is Sephardi and not Ashkenazi, and a vast amount of the Ashkenazi population doesn't really know Yiddish either. So I think that's very important that that we have that language in common. It's great that Israelis learn to speak English, and I wish they did that better too. But I think it's very important from the identity point of view that the community abroad also learns to speak Hebrew.
Gil, can I offer you the question?
I want to speak in ideological terms of what I call identity Zionism. And we know that John Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. I want to ask, what can your country do for you? I think the conversation has to be, what does it mean for me as a young American Jew, as a young British Jew, as a young Australian Jew, for me to have this extraordinary adventure, the greatest adventure in Jewish life today, called Israel? What does it do for me? And how does it, rather than, you see, for too many years, we did have this sort of guilt trip of you have to help Israel. But I really want to know, how does Israel help you? In an age where the Surgeon General warns us that there's an epidemic in America of loneliness, that there's an epidemic of teenage mental health trouble, when we see how many of our young people, our best and brightest, come to universities and they go straight to university health clinics, because not because they've only been under such pressure to get into Brandeis or Harvard or wherever, but because they've been stripped of their souls, because they don't know who they are. And we, Jewish people, as you said earlier, Leah, we have this amazing story. We don't speak in decades, we don't speak in centuries, we speak in millennia. And Israelis too need that identity Zionism piece. And to the extent we really start a conversation about what is the significance of being in 2024, how lucky we are to have a Jewish state with all its challenges and all its headaches and all its heartbreak, which we're experiencing right now. How lucky we are to see this extraordinary generation of young soldiers read those letters that they write before they go into Gaza and that are all too often read at their funerals. The values, the grit, the love. You know, I know we love to yell about them and scream about them as how they're the iPhone generation. These kids, and it's men and women.
I just want to do their laundry.
Yeah, these kids, men and women, have blown us away and have shown us how wonderful a generation they are. And I think there's a lot to learn from them. Mm-hmm. And so I think we really have to start talking, not, I mean, I'm all for programs and that's very important, but to really bring in that identity Zionism piece of what is this extraordinary thing? And Israelis too need to understand why they're doing what they're doing and why they're living here. And so it's a Venn diagram. There are certain ways, both as moderns and as Jews, that we have very, very common experiences, common concerns, common afflictions, common challenges. And we also, in many ways, have different accents, although your English is very good, Avital, and different concerns. And I think we can also leverage that to create a very robust conversation, but it really starts with the ideology, and then it gets to the programs that express the ideology.
I agree with all really that's been said before and said very eloquently. What I would add is I think much more than when he wrote it, Rabidovich's Bavel v'Yerushalayim as a model, the idea of thinking, as Sid also said about Babylon and Jerusalem, is timely. And I say that because although I side with everything Gil said, we also need a very strong diaspora. And it's not an anti-Zionist act to want to strengthen the North American diaspora. On the contrary, strengthening the North American diaspora strengthens Israel and Zionism and identity as well. And my sense is this is a very important moment for strengthening North American Jewish life. We're seeing the dream of, oh, we can go to any school, we can go to any university. That dream is being shattered, which means the Jewish community is going to, I think, turn much more inward one of those great inward transformations like after 1881 or, as Gil said, 67, and building a stronger diaspora, celebrating the strengths of the diaspora, and encouraging what has actually gone on beneath the surface in the last years, where Israel has learned from America. Think of what America has done in terms of women's roles and the impact on Israel, and American Jews have learned in the other direction from Israel. And we want more of that. And our ideal should be to have the strongest possible Bavel and the strongest possible Israel, and for them to be mutually interactive and mutually strengthening. That, to me, would be the great goal to which we should aspire. And in a world where 90% of Jews live either in the one or the other, it seems to me that that is doable.
Thank you. Wow, this has been an amazing experience, very insightful, very deep, and I have to say, from where I'm standing, I thank you all. I thank you, Jonathan, for your insight. I thank you, Liat, for recognizing what New Jersey is. And I thank you, Gil, for your amazing John F. Kennedy imitation. In addition to the insights, and I do apologize because we've really run out of time, and I know there were several questions that came up, which I believe were answered as well in the ongoing dialogue. And I hope that those of you who saw this and participated in this tonight had your questions answered. If you still have questions, please feel free to write us, and we'll do our best to get the questions answered. And I definitely want to thank our distinguished panelists and to wish everyone who participated tonight, this afternoon, depending on what part of the globe you're at, a good week and a good day. And I encourage you to visit our website, where you'll find a recording of this panel discussion, as well as our previous and future Zoomcasts. You'll see the address just behind me on your left for our website, and you can find it on the website. So on behalf of Aliyah Pavley and Ofer and Avital and myself, I want to thank our panelists, Ms. Collins, Professor Sarna, Professor Troy, for a stimulating discussion. And thank everybody for joining us. So from Israel and from Aliyah Pavley, I want to wish you all a shalom. And together we will do amazing things. And I do believe we're on our way to working together to an amazing future. Thank you all, and have a good week. Shavua Tov.
Thanks for joining. As always, Olim Chadashim, we're here to help you. AliyahPavley.com.